The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as a young boy stood at the entrance of Riverside Middle School, clutching his backpack straps tightly. At 12 years old, Alex was used to being the new kid. His father's career had moved them several times, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was because his dad was now the school's new principal, a fact they decided to keep quiet for a while. The hallways buzzed with the usual middle school energy as Alex made his way to his first class. Other students rushed past, some giving him curious glances, others too absorbed in their own conversations to notice. His schedule showed English with Mrs. Cooper first period, and he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. English had always been his favorite subject. As he entered room 203, the first thing he noticed was how perfectly arranged everything was. Every poster hung exactly level, each desk aligned in military precision. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Cooper, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her posture as rigid as the rules posted on her wall. She didn't smile when Alex handed her his transfer slip. "Another new student," she said, adjusting her glasses as she examined the paper. Her voice carried a hint of displeasure, as if his arrival had somehow disrupted her carefully ordered world. "Take the seat in the back row." Alex nodded politely and made his way to his assigned seat, careful not to bump into any desks. He could feel Mrs. Cooper's eyes following him, studying his every move. As he settled into his chair, he noticed how far he was from the rest of the students. The next closest desk was 3 seats away. The class began with a discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird, a book Alex had already read at his previous school. When he raised his hand to contribute, Mrs. Cooper's gaze swept past him as if he were invisible. After the third time this happened, he slowly lowered his hand, confusion settling in his stomach like a heavy stone. During the writing exercise, Alex worked diligently on his analysis, drawing parallels between the book's themes and modern society. He'd learned from his father that good work spoke for itself. When Mrs. Cooper collected the papers, she paused at his desk, picking up his assignment with 2 fingers as if it might bite. "I expect proper formatting and legible handwriting," she announced to the class, holding up Alex's paper. "This will not do." But when the boy sitting next to him glimpsed the paper, his eyes widened. Alex's handwriting was neat, and his formatting followed the guidelines perfectly. The rest of the class period felt like an eternity. Every time Alex moved, Mrs. Cooper found reason to comment. "Sit still," she'd snap, or "Stop fidgeting with your pencil." By the time the bell rang, the other students were giving him sympathetic looks. As he packed up his belongings, a friendly voice whispered, "Don't worry about Mrs. Cooper. She's like that with everyone." But Alex had been in enough schools to know that wasn't entirely true. He'd seen the way she smiled at certain students while barely acknowledging others. Walking to his next class, Alex debated whether to tell his father about Mrs. Cooper. Dr. Thompson, as his dad was known at school, had always taught him to handle his own challenges when possible. "Life isn't always fair," he'd say, "but it's how we respond that defines us." Still, something about Mrs. Cooper's behavior felt different from the usual new kid treatment. The way she'd singled him out, the unnecessary criticism, the isolation at the back of the room, it all seemed calculated. But Alex decided to give it time. Maybe things would improve once she got to know him better. What Alex didn't realize was that this was just the beginning. As he headed to his next class, Mrs. Cooper was already making notes in her gray book, her pen pressing so hard it nearly tore through the paper. She had no idea that the quiet new student she just tried to humiliate was the son of her new boss, and her actions would soon set in motion a chain of events that would change Riverside Middle School forever. Over the next few weeks, Alex's hopes of things improving in Mrs. Cooper's class slowly faded like autumn leaves turning brown. Despite turning in every assignment on time and raising his hand only when he was completely sure of the answer, nothing seemed to please her. The morning routine became increasingly difficult. His stomach would tighten as he approached room 203, knowing what awaited him inside. One particularly chilly morning, Alex arrived early to find his desk had been moved even further back, now tucked away in the corner near the supply closet. The distance between him and his classmates had grown from 3 seats to what felt like a mile. When he politely asked Mrs. Cooper about the move, she replied curtly, "It's to minimize distractions," though Alex had never disrupted the class once. During group discussions, his classmates would crane their necks to look back at him, their faces showing a mix of confusion and sympathy. Tom, a friendly boy who sat near the front, often tried to include Alex in conversations, but Mrs. Cooper would quickly redirect the discussion. "We don't have time for everyone to speak," she'd say, though she seemed to have plenty of time for certain other students' contributions. The graded assignments told their own story. While other students received detailed feedback and encouraging notes, Alex's papers came back with red marks highlighting minor spacing errors or questioning his word choices, despite his careful attention to the rubric. One day, he received a C on an essay about friendship and community, the same essay his previous English teacher had used as an example of excellent writing at his old school. During lunch breaks, Alex found himself making friends despite Mrs. Cooper's attempts to isolate him. Tom and a few others regularly invited him to their table, sharing snacks and swapping stories about their favorite video games and books. "I don't get it," Tom said one day, keeping his voice low. "Your answers in class are always spot on. It's like she's got something against you." The situation reached a new level when Mrs. Cooper announced a special project. Students would work in pairs to create presentations about their favorite authors. As she read out the partnerships, Alex sat up straight, hoping to work with one of his new friends. But when she finished assigning pairs, his name hadn't been called. "Mrs. Cooper?" He raised his hand. "I don't have a partner." She looked up from her list, adjusting her glasses with that familiar look of disdain. "Oh yes. Well, since we have an odd number, you'll have to work alone. I'm sure you can handle it, given your—" She paused, her lips tightening, "independent nature." That evening, Alex spent hours researching his chosen author, determined to create a presentation that even Mrs. Cooper couldn't criticize. His father noticed him working late and asked about the project. "Everything okay, son? You've been quieter than usual lately." Alex considered telling him about Mrs. Cooper, but held back. He'd overheard his father on the phone earlier, dealing with budget issues and staff meetings. The last thing he wanted was to add to his dad's worries. "Just working on a big project," he replied with a small smile. The next day in class, Mrs. Cooper announced that presentations would be twice as long for solo presenters. "After all," she said, looking directly at Alex, "you have no partner to share the workload." Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even those who usually stayed quiet began to whisper among themselves about the unfairness. Tom raised his hand. "Mrs. Cooper, my partner, and I could make room for Alex in our group." "That won't be necessary," she replied sharply. "Some students need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet." During recess, a small group gathered around Alex's lunch table. "This isn't right," Tom said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "You should tell someone." "Like who?" Another student asked. "Mrs. Cooper's been here forever. My older sister had her 3 years ago, and she was just as bad then." What none of them knew was that change was coming. In the teacher's lounge, other faculty members had begun to notice Mrs. Cooper's behavior. Mr. Chen, the science teacher, had mentioned his concerns to the guidance counselor. The school secretary had overheard Mrs. Cooper's sharp comments during morning announcements. And most importantly, a stack of previously ignored complaint forms was about to land on the new principal's desk. Complaints that would finally get the attention they deserved. As Alex walked home that afternoon, clutching his project notes and trying to figure out how to double the length of his presentation overnight, he had no idea that the next day would bring everything to a head. Mrs. Cooper's treatment of him was about to backfire in a way she never could have anticipated, and the quiet new student she tried so hard to diminish would become the catalyst for long overdue change at Riverside Middle School. The morning of the presentations arrived with gray clouds hanging low over Riverside Middle School. Alex had stayed up late, practicing his speech until the words blurred together on the page. He'd chosen to present on an author who wrote about overcoming adversity, a choice that felt particularly meaningful now. Room 203 buzzed with nervous energy as students arranged their visual aids and rehearsed in whispers. Alex set up his carefully prepared poster board at his corner desk, double-checking that every quote was properly cited and each image was perfectly aligned. He'd even added extra research to fill the doubled presentation time Mrs. Cooper had assigned him. "Remember," Mrs. Cooper announced, tapping her ruler against her desk for attention. Presentations will be graded on content, delivery, and time management. Her gaze lingered on Alex. Those presenting alone are expected to maintain the same high standards as paired students. The first few presentations went smoothly. Tom and his partner gave an engaging talk about their author, receiving warm applause and a rare smile from Mrs. Cooper. As more pairs presented, Alex noticed a pattern. Mrs. Cooper's questions afterward were encouraging, helping students expand on their ideas. Finally, it was his turn. Alex walked to the front of the room, his poster board held steady despite his trembling hands. He barely opened his mouth to speak when Mrs. Cooper cut in. "Stand straight," she commanded, "and face the class properly. Basic presentation skills should be obvious by your age." Alex adjusted his posture and began again. He spoke clearly about his chosen author, just as he'd practiced. But 30 seconds in, Mrs. Cooper interrupted again. "Speak up. And what's that paper in your hand? Are you reading from notes? That will cost you points." "No, ma'am," Alex replied quietly. "These are just my citations for the quotes I'm using." "Citations should be memorized," she said sharply. "Continue, but without the crutch of notes." Heart pounding, Alex set his papers aside. He'd memorized most of it anyway, but now the pressure made his thoughts scatter like leaves in a storm. Still, he pressed on, determined to finish strong. He was describing his author's most famous work when Mrs. Cooper cut in for the third time. "You're spending too long on background information. At this rate, you'll never finish in the allotted time." "But you said solo presenters had to speak twice as long," a voice called from the back of the room. It was Tom, unable to stay quiet any longer. "I don't recall asking for your input," Mrs. Cooper snapped. Then she turned back to Alex. "Continue. Though at this point, I'm not sure how you can salvage this presentation." Alex took a deep breath, thinking of his father's words about responding to unfairness with dignity. "Ma'am," he said politely but firmly, "I've followed all the assignment guidelines. I've done the research, prepared the visual aids, and practiced to fit the extended time requirement. If you'll allow me to continue." Mrs. Cooper's face flushed red. "Are you arguing with me? This is exactly the kind of disruptive behavior I've come to expect from you. Go to the principal's office. Immediately." The class fell silent. Several students half rose from their seats in protest, but Alex held up his hand slightly, signaling them to stay quiet. With careful movements, he gathered his presentation materials. "Leave those here," Mrs. Cooper commanded. "I'll grade what I've seen, which is clearly not up to standards." Alex hesitated for just a moment before placing his poster board and papers on his desk. As he walked toward the door, he heard whispers of encouragement from his classmates. Tom looked like he wanted to say something more, but Alex gave him a small smile and shake of his head. The walk to the principal's office felt longer than usual. Alex's mind raced with thoughts about how to explain this to his father. They'd kept their relationship quiet to avoid special treatment, but now he wondered if staying quiet had been the right choice. The school secretary looked up as he entered the office area. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Cooper sent me to see the principal," Alex said quietly. "Dr. Thompson will see you right away," she replied, giving him a kind look. She'd witnessed enough of Mrs. Cooper's actions over the past weeks to know something wasn't right. As Alex approached his father's office door, he straightened his shoulders. Whatever happened next would change things, not just for him, but for every student who'd ever felt powerless in Mrs. Cooper's classroom. He knocked on the door, and his father's familiar voice called out, "Come in." The moment had arrived for Mrs. Cooper to learn that sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways, and that the student she'd chosen to target was the son of the one person in the school who could finally hold her accountable for years of unfair treatment. Dr. Thompson looked up from his desk as Alex entered the office, his expression shifting from professional to concerned father in an instant. The morning sunlight streaming through the window caught the silver in his hair that had gained more gray over the past month of silently watching his son struggle. "Alex," he said softly, closing the folder he'd been reviewing. "What happened?" For a moment, Alex just stood there, his shoulders tight with tension. All the weeks of holding back, of trying to handle things on his own, suddenly felt too heavy to carry. His eyes burned with unshed tears. Mrs. Cooper sent me out of class, he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, during my presentation. Dr. Thompson gestured to the chair across from his desk, but instead of sitting behind it as the principal, he moved to sit next to his son. "Tell me everything." And so Alex did. He told his father about the isolated desk in the corner, the ignored raised hands, the harsh criticisms of perfect work. He described the doubled presentation time, the interruptions, the impossible standards. As he spoke, his father's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Dr. Thompson asked gently, though he already knew the answer. Alex had inherited his own determination to handle challenges independently. "I didn't want to make things harder for you," Alex replied, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "You were already dealing with so much as the new principal." And he hesitated. "I thought maybe if I just worked harder, tried to be perfect, she'd treat me fairly." Dr. Thompson reached for a tissue box and handed it to his son. "You know what I see when I look at you?" he asked. "I see a young man who showed more maturity and patience than most adults would have. But sometimes being strong means knowing when to ask for help." He stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. "What you don't know is that I've been gathering information. Other teachers have come to me with concerns about Mrs. Cooper's behavior. Parents have filed complaints, but seeing it happen to you..." He shook his head, his voice tight with emotion. "I needed to be completely sure, to have all the evidence before taking action." A knock at the door interrupted them. The school secretary poked her head in. "Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Cooper is here. She says she needs to discuss a disciplinary issue." Father and son exchanged a look. "Send her in," Dr. Thompson said, straightening his tie. "Alex, you can stay." Mrs. Cooper burst into the office, her face still flushed with anger. "Dr. Thompson, I need to discuss a student's inappropriate behavior." Her voice trailed off as she saw Alex sitting there. "I don't think it's appropriate for him to be present during this discussion." "I think it's exactly appropriate," Dr. Thompson replied calmly. "After all, we're discussing my son." The color drained from Mrs. Cooper's face. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. She sank into the nearest chair, her rigid posture crumbling. "I've been watching," Dr. Thompson continued, his voice level but firm, "not just as the principal, but as a father. I've seen how you've treated Alex, and I've discovered it's part of a pattern that goes back years." He opened the folder on his desk, revealing dozens of documented incidents. Other students, other parents, other teachers, they've all seen it. But until now, their concerns were dismissed or ignored. That ends today. Mrs. Cooper's hands trembled as she gripped her skirt. "You don't understand," she started, but Dr. Thompson held up his hand. "No, I understand perfectly. You chose to target a student you thought had no one to stand up for him. You abused your position of authority to make a child feel small. What you didn't know was that every time you moved his desk further away, every time you dismissed his work, every time you tried to humiliate him in front of his classmates, you were showing me exactly who you are." Alex watched as his father transformed from the gentle dad who made him breakfast every morning into the strong leader the school needed. It was like watching two worlds finally merge, the father who taught him about justice and the principal who could make that justice real. "There will be a formal review," Dr. Thompson concluded. "Until then, you are relieved of your teaching duties. Please gather your personal belongings and check in with the main office." As Mrs. Cooper stumbled out of the office, Alex felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His father turned to him with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner," Dr. Thompson said, pulling his son into a hug. "But I'm so proud of how you handled yourself. You showed real strength, not by staying quiet, but by standing up for what's right when the moment came." Looking up at his father, Alex realized that sometimes the biggest victories come not from fighting back, but from holding on to your dignity until the truth can finally come to light. Word spread through Riverside Middle School like wildfire. Mrs. Cooper was gone, at least temporarily, and something big was happening. In the days that followed, Dr. Thompson's office became a revolving door of stories that should have been told long ago. One morning, a shy girl from the previous year's class came forward with her mother. She'd been too scared to speak up before, but hearing about Alex's experience gave her courage. She used to make me read out loud even though I had a stutter, the girl explained, her voice stronger now. She'd let other kids laugh and say it was motivation to do better. Mr. Chen, the science teacher, brought in a thick folder of his own. I've been keeping records, he said, spreading papers across Dr. Thompson's desk. Times when students came to my class upset after being in room 203. Dates when I heard her making inappropriate comments in the hallway. I wanted to do something, but he shook his head. The previous administration always brushed it off. The school counselor added her observations. The number of students asking to switch out of Mrs. Cooper's class was unusually high. Some even pretended to be sick to avoid going to her class. But without concrete evidence of misconduct, we couldn't take action. Tom and his friends created a ripple effect of their own. Once they started talking about what they'd witnessed in class, other students found their voices too. The school board received dozens of letters describing similar experiences, students being singled out, criticized unfairly, or made to feel unwelcome in their own classroom. One particularly moving testimony came from a former student who'd graduated 3 years ago. I almost gave up on school because of her, he wrote. I thought I was stupid because she kept telling me my writing was worthless. It wasn't until I got to high school and my new teachers praised my work that I realized the problem wasn't me. The investigation revealed a pattern spanning over a decade. Former administrators had received complaints but filed them away without action. Some teachers had tried to speak up but were told not to rock the boat. Parents' concerns were dismissed as oversensitive or helicopter parenting. Dr. Thompson worked late into the evenings, carefully documenting everything. His secretary noticed him skipping lunch to interview students and teachers. You need to take care of yourself too, she reminded him, bringing him coffee one afternoon. These kids needed someone to listen years ago, he replied, reviewing another statement. I won't let them down now. Alex, meanwhile, found himself at the center of an unexpected wave of support. Students he barely knew stopped him in the hallways to share their own stories. You know what's crazy? Tom said during lunch one day. Everyone was feeling the same way, but we were all too scared to say anything. Sometimes it just takes one person to break the silence. The substitute teacher who took over Mrs. Cooper's class noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere. Students who had been silent for months suddenly participated in discussions. The boy with the stutter volunteered to read aloud, and his classmates patiently encouraged him. The back corner desk was pulled forward to join the others. One afternoon, the school board called an emergency meeting. Dr. Thompson presented his findings, not just the recent testimonies, but years of buried complaints and documented incidents. The evidence was overwhelming. This isn't just about one teacher or one student, he explained to the board. This is about a system that allowed prejudice and bullying to continue unchecked. We failed these kids by staying silent. Now we have a chance to make it right. The board members sat in stunned silence as they reviewed the documentation. Some had been serving for years and had dismissed similar complaints themselves. Now, faced with the full scope of the situation, they couldn't look away. What do you recommend? The board chairman finally asked. Dr. Thompson laid out a detailed plan. First, we need a complete review of our complaint procedures. Every student's voice matters, and they need to know they'll be heard. Second, we need mandatory training for all staff on creating an inclusive classroom environment. And third, he paused, making eye contact with each board member, we need to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. As he drove home that evening with Alex, Dr. Thompson felt both exhausted and hopeful. You know, he said, sometimes the hardest part of fixing a problem is getting people to admit it exists. But once the truth comes out, healing can begin. Alex looked at his father, seeing both the dedicated principal and the caring dad who had taught him to stand up for what's right. Do you think things will really change? They already have, Dr. Thompson smiled. Because one brave kid refused to let unfairness win, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope as they drove home, both knowing that tomorrow would bring them one step closer to the school they all deserved. A place where every student could feel safe, valued, and heard. The day of the formal review arrived with a tension that could be felt throughout Riverside Middle School. The meeting room, usually used for cheerful parent-teacher conferences, now felt heavy with purpose. Board members filed in quietly, taking their seats around the long oak table as sunlight filtered through the blinds. Dr. Thompson arrived early, arranging his documents with careful precision. Each paper represented a voice that needed to be heard, a story that could no longer be ignored. The school board chairman sat at the head of the table, his usual friendly smile replaced by a serious expression that matched the gravity of the situation. "Before we begin," the chairman announced, "I want to remind everyone that this meeting is about finding truth and ensuring justice. We're not here to attack anyone, but to make sure our school lives up to its responsibility to protect every student." Mrs. Cooper arrived with her union representative, her usual confident stride notably absent. She'd traded her typical bright sweaters for a somber gray suit that seemed to drain the color from her face. Her hands clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Mrs. Cooper," the chairman began, "you've been teaching at Riverside for 15 years. Your academic records show consistently high test scores from your students. Yet what we've uncovered suggests a pattern of behavior that directly contradicts our school's values." Dr. Thompson opened the first folder. "We have documented incidents spanning more than a decade," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Students who were isolated, criticized unfairly, made to feel unwelcome in their own classroom. Would you like to explain your actions?" Mrs. Cooper straightened in her chair. "I maintain high standards," she replied, her voice scratchy but defensive. "Not every student is willing to meet those standards. Perhaps some are too sensitive for constructive criticism." Constructive criticism. Dr. Thompson pulled out a student's essay covered in harsh red marks. "Like telling a 12-year-old their writing is worthless, or moving a student's desk to the corner because they're too distracting when they've never disrupted class." The union representative shifted uncomfortably as more evidence was presented. Each testimony, each incident report, each buried complaint painted a picture that couldn't be explained away by high standards. "What about the boy with the stutter?" a board member asked. "Multiple witnesses say you forced him to read aloud, knowing he struggled, and allowed other students to laugh." "He needed to overcome his weakness," Mrs. Cooper insisted, but her voice wavered. "The real world won't coddle them like you want me to." Dr. Thompson leaned forward. "The real world also has laws against discrimination, rules against creating hostile environments. The real world holds people accountable for their actions." "Are you accusing me of discrimination?" Mrs. Cooper's voice rose sharply. "I've taught hundreds of students. Some of them even came back to thank me." "Yes, some succeeded despite your treatment," Dr. Thompson agreed. "But how many gave up? How many started hating school, doubting themselves, believing they weren't good enough because one teacher decided they didn't deserve fair treatment?" The room fell silent as Dr. Thompson placed a final folder on the table. "And then there's my son, Alex. You didn't know he was my son when you singled him out, did you? When you interrupted his presentation, ignored his raised hand, criticized his perfect work." Mrs. Cooper's face paled further. I didn't." "You didn't know?" Dr. Thompson finished for her. "Just like you didn't know the girl you mocked for her accent would become a speech therapist. Or that the boy whose writing you called worthless would publish award-winning poetry in high school. You didn't know because you didn't care to know your students as people." The union representative whispered something to Mrs. Cooper, but she shook her head. Years of justifications and excuses seemed to crumble as she faced the truth of her actions. "I just wanted them to be better," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Better." Dr. Thompson's voice was quiet but powerful. "Better at what?" "Better at staying quiet when treated unfairly. Better at accepting discrimination. Better at believing they deserve less than others." Tears filled Mrs. Cooper's eyes, not from remorse, the board members noticed, but from finally being held accountable. Her carefully constructed world of authority and control was falling apart. "The evidence is clear," the chairman announced. "Mrs. Cooper, your actions have caused significant harm to countless students. This board cannot allow such behavior to continue in our school." As the meeting concluded, Dr. Thompson gathered his papers, thinking of Alex and every other student who'd sat in room 203 feeling alone and unworthy. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, as if nature itself was acknowledging that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest changes. The story wasn't over. There would be paperwork, procedures, and healing ahead. But in that moment, as Mrs. Cooper walked out of the meeting room for the last time, everyone knew that Riverside Middle School would never be the same. The truth had finally come to light, and with it came the promise of a better tomorrow for every student who would walk through those halls. Spring brought more than just new flowers to Riverside Middle School. 3 months after Mrs. Cooper's departure, the hallways buzzed with a different kind of energy. The fear that once lingered around room 203 had been replaced by something wonderful hope. Dr. Thompson stood at the front of the auditorium, looking out at the sea of faces before him. Students, teachers, parents, and board members had gathered for a special assembly. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, highlighting the colorful banners that read, "Every Voice Matters" and "Building a Better Tomorrow." "When I first came to Riverside," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I saw a school with incredible potential. But potential isn't enough if some students feel unwelcome or unworthy. Real education can only happen when every single student feels safe and valued." In the front row, Alex sat with Tom and their classmates. Their new English teacher, Ms. Wilson, had brought a fresh energy to room 203. She'd rearranged the desks into small groups, encouraging collaboration and discussion. The back corner that had once felt like a punishment was now a cozy reading nook with cushions and a small bookshelf. "The changes we've made aren't just about one classroom or one teacher," Dr. Thompson continued. "We've created new ways for students to speak up when something's wrong. Every complaint will be heard, every concern addressed. But more importantly, we're building a community where such complaints become rare because respect and fairness are the norm." He gestured to a group of teachers seated on stage. "Our staff has completed extensive training on creating inclusive classrooms. They've learned new techniques for supporting different learning styles, understanding cultural differences, and making sure every student has a chance to shine." The boy who stuttered had started a support group for students with speech challenges. What began as 3 nervous kids meeting during lunch had grown into a confident circle of friends who helped each other practice presentation skills. Their latest group project had earned the highest grade in class. "But the real heroes of this story are the students," Dr. Thompson smiled, his eyes meeting his son's. "Those who found the courage to speak up, not just for themselves but for others. Those who supported their classmates when they felt alone. Those who showed us that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it's hard." In the audience, some of Mrs. Cooper's former students wiped away tears. The girl who'd been mocked for her accent was now tutoring younger students in both English and her native language. The boy whose writing had been called worthless had just won first place in the district's poetry contest. "We've also made changes to our curriculum," Dr. Thompson explained. "Our library now includes books by authors from all walks of life. Our history classes tell complete stories, not just selected versions. Our art and music programs celebrate diverse traditions. Because education isn't just about learning facts, it's about understanding the world in all its beautiful complexity." The school counselor stood up to share some numbers. Student attendance had improved significantly. Requests for class transfers had dropped to almost zero. And most importantly, students reported feeling safer and more confident in their classrooms. "But our work isn't finished," Dr. Thompson reminded everyone. "Creating a truly inclusive school is an ongoing journey. We need to stay vigilant, keep listening, and always be ready to stand up for what's right." As the assembly ended, students gathered in small groups, talking excitedly about their plans for the next school year. Alex overheard someone say, "You know what's cool? Now when I raise my hand, I know I'll be heard." Later that afternoon, Dr. Thompson found Alex waiting by his office. "Ready to head home, son?" "Almost," Alex replied. "I just wanted to show you something." He pulled out his latest English assignment, an essay about personal growth. At the top, Ms. Wilson had written, "Your voice is powerful. Never stop using it." Father and son shared a smile, both knowing that the real victory wasn't just in removing one unfair teacher. It was in showing every student that they deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. It was in proving that speaking up could create real change. As they walked to the car, they passed room 203. Through the open door, they could see students laughing and talking as they worked on group projects. The afternoon sun lit up the new poster on the wall that read, "In this classroom, everyone's story matters." "You know what?" Alex said thoughtfully. "Sometimes the worst experiences lead to the best changes." Dr. Thompson put his arm around his son's shoulders. "And sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back, it's standing strong until the truth can come to light." The spring breeze carried the sound of children playing on the playground, their voices free and unafraid. Riverside Middle School had transformed from a place where some students felt silenced to a community where every voice could soar. And it all started because one boy refused to let unfairness win, one father chose to listen, and together they showed that positive change is always possible when people stand up for what's right.